So today we're building ViaAmber a new gaming PC, but not just any generic gaming mid-tower. This one's a little bit different. Now for those of you who don't know Amber, she's a streamer over on Twitch who mainly plays Valorant, but her content covers a wide range of topics varying from custom mechanical keyboards to photography, singing, and even short-form content. Now for a bit of context, her current system uses a 10900K and a 2070, which for an esports gamer is sufficient enough, but there have been some instances where she loses frames and on occasion even experiences some blue screens, and just overall isn't getting the performance or stability that you would expect. So I reached out to her a little bit ago and offered to build her a new system. She of course agreed, and fast forward to today, we now have all the parts on hand, and I cannot wait to start building this thing. Let's take a look.
Now starting off with the PC case, this one is a little bit different because driving the build theme was the desire for an all-white aesthetic, but in a small, compact package. That of course would influence the hardware going inside of it, and after going back and forth with Amber on this topic, in the end we did decide on Cooler Master's NR200P in white. This is an 18-liter small form factor case with some of the best hardware compatibility for an ITX enclosure. We have room for 3 slot graphics cards up to 336mm long, 280mm radiator support, 2 top exhaust fans, and very breathable ventilated panels, opening up the potential for a seriously high performance machine. For those of you who have seen my personal system inside the NCase M1, this should all sound very familiar. The NR200P is essentially an XL version of that case, so building in it should feel right at home. With that being said, I did want to keep the system as user-friendly as possible, while keeping it visually appealing as well. The NR200P does come with an optional glass side panel, which we will be using to display the system internals. Unfortunately, that does mean that we lose any liquid cooling support, as the side bracket for mounting radiators would be obstructed. There is another catch with this case as well. As you could probably tell, the glass panel that ships with the white variant of this case has a black border, which just doesn't make any sense for a white spec build. And to make matters even worse, the vented top panel is actually more of a dusty gray. Now, a while back, Cooler Master released a run of varying colorways. One of them, Caribbean Blue, shipped with a white variant of the glass and mesh panels. So to make this build extra special, I've sourced this colorway and we will be swapping out these panels for a full factory spec whiteout NR200P. Unfortunately, these colorways are no longer in production and very hard to get your hands on. So while these colors are something that could have been solved with a DIY paint can, that just wouldn't do this build justice, and really nothing can beat the satisfaction of factory paint, making this a truly rare spec. Now for the GPU, I've decided on the RTX 4070 Ti Super. This one here is the Zotac Trinity, and although this is only about 9% faster than the non-super variant, the similar prices just make more sense. This is a newer card and with a pretty significant bump to the memory spec. 16 gigs of GDDR6X memory over the previous 12, and on a wider 256-bit bus up from 192. Moving into the future, with games becoming more demanding with heavier texture packs and 1440p gaming becomes more accessible, this spec change will help with the longevity of the system. But 4070 Ti Super is already a powerhouse and will be a monstrous performance jump for Amber. We're essentially getting RTX 3090 Ti performance here, but at nearly 200 watts power reduction. With a beefy triple slot cooler strapped to this thing and the amount of airflow within the NR200, thermals while gaming will be absolutely no issue. As for the CPU, we're going with the i5 14600KF. While the X3D chips are technically the fastest gaming options available at the moment, the extra cores and threads here over a similarly priced Ryzen will help out a ton in production type workloads, and that's really going to help Amber with her content creation goals. With 14 cores and 20 threads that can boost up to 5.2 GHz, realistically you could pair this with a 4090 and there would be no bottlenecking in sight.
Now let's address the elephant in the room, and I'm sure you're all probably thinking, with the recent oxidation and overvolting issues that 13th and 14th gen have had, why would anyone even go near Intel? And that's a very valid point. I will mention that the previous version of this build did use a 13600K, and if it hadn't been for the large percentage of oxidation issues, I probably wouldn't have swapped it out with the 14600K that we have here. Although now the issue becomes overvolting, and to be honest, I don't really see this as an issue because this is something that has been known about ever since the arrival of 12th gen, and I think it's pretty common practice at this point to dial in your own power and voltage settings. Luckily for me, I'm very comfortable doing this, and we will be jumping into the BIOS to help optimize some of these settings and mitigate this issue.
Of course, we need a new motherboard to plug everything into, and I figured since we're building a brand new system from the ground up, it only makes sense to upgrade to the new stuff while we have the chance. So here I'm going with the cleanest option available for LGA 1700, and that is the B760i Edge from MSI. There's no real need for an overbuilt Z790 board here. We won't be overclocking the CPU anyways. In fact, the biggest selling point for this board, and why I didn't go with AMD either, was simply due to the rear I/O connectivity. Again, Amber uses a lot of devices, so we definitely need an appropriate amount of USB ports to support all of her gadgets. And I count 7 of them being back here, with one of them being Type-C, as well as 2 M.2 slots, with one of them being round the back. This board is also passively cooled, which means no extra noise coming from small fans on the VRM or anything like that. And all the while cutting back on crazy M.2 stacks or overbuilt heat sinks, which certainly isn't necessary here. It's a pretty solid board overall. Then for the RAM, since we're rolling on a DDR5 platform now, we'll be chucking in 32 gigs of Corsair's Dominator Titanium, clocked at 6000 MHz CL30. Some of the best looking sticks on the market with the most jacked heat spreaders that I've ever seen. That's both a good thing and a bad thing. On one hand, they definitely stand out and have some really good looking RGB on top, but at 55mm tall, we definitely need to be cautious about the CPU cooler setup here. As I mentioned, liquid cooling is off the table for the case configuration we want to run, so sticking with air cooling, I've decided on ID Cooling's A610. We'll be setting this up in a push-pull configuration with a pair of Be Quiet's Lightwings RGB fans. With peak power draw of the 14600K around 180 watts in CPU workloads, the A610 should cope just fine. CPU rendering will be the secondary purpose of the system behind gaming, so I really don't see this ever becoming a problem, but we can always dial things back with a slight power limit if things get a bit too toasty. Then for storage, we're going quite dense here. 2 2TB sticks from WD. These are their SN850X NVMe drives. These are PCIe Gen 4 as well, with read-write speeds of over 7 GB per second. Her current build only has 1 TB of total storage, so this will be a pretty overkill upgrade if I'm being honest, but that's okay. Then for the power supply, the NR200 supports SFX units only, so here we're going with the best white option available, and that is the V850, also from Cooler Master. 850 watts, 80 plus gold rated will be plenty for any single GPU setup for the foreseeable future. Even a 4090 at full blast pulling 450 watts would be absolutely no issue with this unit. Now of course there are a few more bits and pieces, but let's go ahead and skip that and start putting this thing together. So there we have it, the finished build. i5 14600K and 4070 Ti Super in a tiny 18-liter footprint. Honestly, this turned out way cleaner than I expected, and although I'm not the biggest fan of white RGB builds, I actually do enjoy this spec quite a bit. The hardest part of the whole build was probably cable management. As you can imagine, with RGB fans, there is a mess of cables to deal with, so getting everything routed neatly and hooked up to the ARGB hub was quite the challenge. In the end though, I think it looks pretty damn good. The lighting effects definitely steal your attention away from those cables anyways, and all you're left to look at is the insanely clean presentation. And speaking of cables, one of the upgrades I've made is a set of custom cables for the power supply, both from CableMod and P-Slate Customs. I've used CableMod for a while now, and just really like the quality of materials used. P-Slate, on the other hand, is my first time working with them, but they offer the exact cable lengths needed for the NR200, resulting in some very clean and tidy cable runs. I've only used one SATA cable in the build, while the other will be reserved alongside the side bracket and vented panel should Amber ever wish to upgrade to liquid cooling. Of course, that would require a full rework of the cable management, but that's totally up to her. Now, some of you might have noticed that the orientation of the CPU cooler is set up as rear intake instead of rear exhaust, and this is to encourage cooler ambient air into the system instead of fighting with the top fans, which directionally would be opposing each other. This will make a lot more sense in just a moment once we take a look at the fan setup on the software side of things. Important note about this cooler is that it gets really close to maxing out what is possible in this case with the glass side panel. At 155mm in height, it's basically grazing the interior of that glass. There's maybe a 1mm gap separating the two, so it's a really snug fit. Also, to help assist in airflow, I've snuck in a pair of slim fans underneath the GPU. These are Corsair's AF120 Slims in white. The Zotac Trinity that we've got in there measures at 58.5mm in total thickness, which leaves just enough clearance for 15mm thick fans. But because of the bowing shape of the GPU shroud, these have to be positioned in a very specific way to where no contact would be made between the fan blades on either side. Now though, let's talk about performance. Starting off with thermals, this is probably the biggest question everyone has, as this is such a small enclosure and they're usually thought to be quite warm. All of the following tests were run with a room ambient of 23 degrees Celsius. For the GPU, I left it running at firm arc for about 1 hour, and thermals top out to around 72 degrees Celsius. This surprised me quite a bit, as I would have expected the glass side panel to have a much more significant impact. But as we can see, things are staying relatively under control, with the top and bottom fans hovering around 1300 RPM, as well as the GPU fans also putting in a bit of work, about 1600 RPM or so. The 4070 Ti Super here also was pulling its full 285 watts. So if we wanted, we could run things a little bit quieter, say 900 RPM or so, and the thermals wouldn't take too much of a hit. As for CPU thermals, I ran 2 render tests in Cinebench and Blender. First with stock power and voltage settings, and the second with a core voltage offset of 75 mV and a 160 watt power limit. Starting off with Cinebench, the first run had the i5 thermal throttling on 3 to 5 of the P cores, hitting above 95 degrees Celsius pretty consistently. This is with unlocked power limits, just letting the motherboard feed it as much power as it wants, which settled into a target of 180 watts. With our power limit and voltage profile applied on the right, we can see a much more tame outcome. While still getting a bit toasty, temperatures stay in the low 90s. And to iterate here, Cinebench testing is not a reflection of all use cases, just respective to how Cinebench itself utilizes the CPU. So if we take a look at the results in Blender using the open benchmark, between the two profiles we see a much more sensible temperature range, sitting pretty happily in the high 80s, which again for an air cooler is decent. The A610 is the thickest heatsink for a single tower air cooler, so the results are respectable. We also have to factor in that the contact frame is really helping out with overall heat distribution to the cooler. This basically represents worst case for the CPU, and there aren't many workloads out there that will push it this far. Again, rendering will be the secondary purpose of this system, and in that case I'd recommend rendering on the GPU instead. Most renderers can take better advantage of the CUDA acceleration found on NVIDIA GPUs like the 4070 Ti Super that we have here. And as usual, I'm using the fan control software to get all the fans wired up in the system, so here's a closer look at how I did that. We've got 6 fans in the system, with each linked up to splitters running to the motherboard, so 2 on the CPU cooler as rear intake, 2 up top exhausting, and 2 at the bottom intaking. The CPU fans are linked up to a graph curve to spin up based off of CPU temperature only, while the bottom fans are linked up to another graph curve to spin up based off of GPU temperature only. This is really important and something that actually can't be done from the motherboard's BIOS, believe it or not. And then for the top fans, this one is a little bit technical. I have these linked up to a mix curve, and that mix is referencing both the CPU graph as well as an additional graph curve that is referencing the GPU as the source temperature. So what this is saying is that it's going to look at both the CPU and GPU temperatures and spin off based off of whichever one is running the hottest while following the targeted graphs. I wanted a separate GPU curve for the top fans to have an equal pull of air to the bottom fans' push when it came to ejecting that warm air out of the case. And as a little cherry on top, I've also set up a hysteresis plot within the GPU graph curves, so the fans should keep spinning for a prolonged period of time after the core has stopped producing heat. This means that the heat-soaked parts get additional cooling on the way down to help aid in effective dissipation rather than resorting to passive cooling. So here, after the core has stopped producing heat, the fans must detect a 2 to 3 degree change over the course of 10 seconds before it can start ramping down. At that point, it will make a 3% adjustment at a time. Really neat little feature about this software, and it's completely free. I highly recommend it for all systems out there, and I'll have a link down below. Also, you might notice that under CPU load, the bottom fans are completely inactive and not helping out the CPU in any way. This is actually intentional for 2 reasons. 1, the fans are mostly blocked by the GPU and wouldn't help out the CPU much anyway, and 2, even in an unrestricted path, the bottom intake would actually impede the rear intake by pushing the air out of the case, which would lead to warmer CPU temperatures. And as you can see from our Cinebench testing, we're already skirting on the edge of what is acceptable with this cooler, so the airflow paths absolutely need to be spot on. When it comes to 1440p gaming though, there's really no issues at all. Jumping into Valorant, Amber's main game, the GPU is only pulling about 140 watts, sitting comfortably below 50 degrees. The i5 is a bit warmer as it's busy spitting out over 400 frames and hitting that pretty consistently. That's pretty impressive considering we've pushed all the quality settings to ultra. But what about something a little bit more demanding? Here we've got Helldivers 2 running completely maxed out and maintaining a stable 90 FPS. And as you can see, this game is giving the GPU a little bit of a workout, looking very similar to what we saw in Firmark, with the temperatures averaging 65 degrees and power draw around 250 watts. The CPU on the other hand is running really comfortably in the mid 70s while barely pulling any power at all, under 100 watts. Here's an idea of what the system sounds like under full load with some mouse clicks for reference.
So yeah, pretty impressed with how this one turned out, especially with those GPU thermals. We're basically rivaling what you would get with an ATX mid-tower, but at just 30% of the total volume, which is pretty mind-blowing. I think Amber's going to be pretty impressed with this system as well, so I'm going to get this over to her. I'll see you in the next one.